Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and our next panel, Ukraine and the Region's Security, will be moderated by General Phil Breedlove. General Breedlove is a retired four-star Air Force general. Phil, as he prefers to be called, last serves as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, commonly referred to as SACEUR, for those that like acronyms. General Eisenhower was the first Supreme Allied Commander leading our forces on D-Day, and Phil was the 17th Supreme Allied Commander, where he commanded military forces of 28 NATO nations. I also want to add, he's an F-16 fighter pilot for most of his career, and he's held 8 major commands spanning both peace and combat situations, but I'm not going to list them. General Breedlove chairs the Frontier Europe Group, which is part of the Middle East Institute and focuses on the Black Sea region. General Breedlove is also a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out he is a very active member of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine network. Phil, the mic is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Bob and Nadia, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I couldn't think of a better time to talk about our subject today, Ukraine and the region's security. To do that, we have 4 awesome panelists. 3 I've worked with for a long time, and 1 I've read almost everything he's written in the last couple of years. First is Ian Brzezinski, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Second is Dr. Don Jensen, Director for Russia and Strategic Stability at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Third is Dr. Yulia Joja, who I have worked with for a while on Black Sea affairs. She is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And then finally is Glenn Howard, who we all know is the president of Jamestown, and I think an organization that has some of the most frank conversations about truth-based reality as it approaches Ukraine and others in the world. So we have a great panel, and I want to just get right to them. I'm going to roll a grenade out on the table with some thoughts, and then we'll get the real experts to go through and talk to us about them. Right now, as we all know, Russia is once again posturing, and reputable sources placing between 80 and 100,000 troops along the Ukraine border. The real question is for what? And as I read and study and talk and ask in my circles, there are several possibilities of what. And I want to just throw a few out on the table, and then we'll get to those, I hope, as we allow each of our panelists to do their opening remarks. Clearly, Russia is pressuring the Zelensky government. Clearly, he is pressuring the Zelensky government, and that could be in support of a coup. Clearly, he is also pressuring NATO and/or the United States to force Ukraine into concessions as it relates to the Normandy format. He could be there to seize more Ukrainian land, for holding the land, or to cause the fall of the Zelensky government. And so with those as just some of the more common discussed themes, our panel will help us to dig further into this. We're going to have a lightning round of opening statements, and then I'll begin by posing a question to each of our panelists. And when we're done with that, I will refer to the questions that you should type into the Q&A section, and we will go to our panelists with your questions. So Ian, to you first.
Okay, Phil, can you hear me?
Yes, It's that
Okay.
unmute button, right?
Yeah, I'm always fighting that. Well, let me start by thanking you for your kind introduction, and to Robert and Nadia of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for convening today's gathering. It's occurring at a time of really heightened tensions in Central Europe, and I'm among those who believe that Russia has positioned itself for another invasion of Ukraine. In fact, today, NATO foreign ministers are convening in Riga to discuss exactly that and what to do to deter such an attack. You know, as the alliance grapples with this crisis, it should remember the United States and NATO actually in the past has successfully deterred Moscow from attacking a European state that is not protected by NATO membership. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter marshaled international action to prevent a massive Soviet invasion of Poland. And I have to admit here, I'm a little bit biased on this because my father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, served as his national security advisor. As is the case today, the 1980 crisis involved a massive Soviet military buildup against a non-NATO state. If you all remember, that summer of 80, Poland's opposition movement Solidarity was gaining great momentum. And Moscow was worried that it could lose control of Poland and the virus of freedom would spread elsewhere throughout the Warsaw Pact. You know, looking back at that situation, Poland's situation was far more daunting than what we face with Ukraine. Poland was a member of an unwilling member of the Warsaw Pact, and it was surrounded entirely by countries of the Moscow-controlled Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union had already stationed 2 divisions on its territory. By December 7th of that year, US intelligence reported to the US president that the Soviet Union had not only decided to attack Poland 2 days prior, but had projected an attack would occur immediately. And my dad wrote in his White House diary the following on December 9th. There is massive evidence, quote, there is massive evidence of movement of Soviet armies. Intelligence has indicated that as of now, there are at least 27 Soviet divisions available for intervention in Poland. Movement is comprehensive on almost every front surrounding Poland. Convoys in motion, divisions, regiments, and communications are all in advanced state of alert. Logistical support units and even hospital facilities have been prepared. Airborne equipment has been loaded onto Soviet aircraft for the deployment of airborne forces. In brief, preparations are massive. And that quote doesn't even include the Czechoslovak and East German divisions that were put on alert to move into Poland. So to deter that attack, Carter's national security team shaped a strategy around the following 3 objectives. First, deny the USSR the advantage of surprise. Second, calm the situation down by convincing the Polish government and Solidarity not to provoke each other unnecessarily and the USSR, while also encouraging both to prepare to resist in the event of an invasion. And then third, dissuading Moscow from invading through international pressure and by increasing the costs and making clear the costs of aggression. They did this overtly and covertly by warning Solidarity, by reaching out to Pope John Paul II to leverage his networks in throughout Poland. A systematic campaign was undertaken to inform and mobilize the support of NATO allies. President Carter reached out to his counterparts in Germany, France, United Kingdom, Canada, as well as Japan, Australia, and others. And that set the stage for a December 11, 12, 1980 NATO and Defense Foreign Ministers meeting. 21 years ago to the month of the Riga meeting occurring now across the pond. NATO defense ministers conducted their meeting as the first of 4 US AWACS landed in Germany to begin over-the-horizon patrols of the frontier. NATO defense ministers made clear if there was an invasion, there would be a significant change in NATO force posture in Europe. NATO foreign ministers, and bear with me, Phil, cut me off if I'm going on too long, but they reviewed a set of firm economic and diplomatic sanctions that would be exercised in the event of invasion of Poland. And this is what was briefed to the press. Terminating all large-scale economic projects, including, what a surprise, a new natural gas pipeline linking Siberia and Western Europe. Suspending all economic credits to the USSR and Poland. Imposing a full grain embargo on the USSR. Ending all shipments of machinery and electronic equipment. Imposing a total trade boycott. Banning all ships from Soviet ships from Western ports. Suspending arms control talks, recalling allied ambassadors to Moscow and curtailing social and political contacts. And the ministerial communique put it bluntly, détente could not survive if the Soviet Union were again to violate the basic rights of any state, the territorial integrity and independence. Poland should be free to decide its own future. Those were the actions the alliance took back in 1980. Those are the actions the alliance took to successfully deter an invasion of Poland. There are many lessons to be learned today from that experience. And it's very important for, I would say, the Biden administration, NATO, to measure their strategy, actions today to deter invasion of Ukraine against what President Carter and his team did back in 1980.
So thank you. We're just doing our opening remarks now, but let me warn you, we'll come back to this in my first question to you and ask you for a little concrete and how you might do these things that you just mentioned in your paper and in your walkthrough. How would we change our current approach to get to that? So thank you very much. Next, for opening remarks, I'd like to turn to Dr. Don Jensen. And sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Phil. And again, thank you to the foundation, Bob and Nadia in particular, for putting this event together and doing so at an incredibly important moment, which they no doubt calculated in advance. I wanted to say something about everybody's hobby the last few weeks, which is trying to decide whether Putin will or will not go in and how. And like everybody else, I've been watching troop movements and every other piece of scrap of information that I can get. But I wanted to emphasize really in my remarks today something different, which is to say we need to keep in mind that this is multi-dimensional pressure. It is I hate to use the H word, but I will. It is a hybrid war. It's not just about whether Putin will attack from Belarus or grab Mariupol. It's about political, diplomatic, energy, economic, informational, religious, and other kinds of pressure on Ukraine, which means that any military-only, non-multidimensional solution, in my view, is not likely to work because Putin, even if there was a ceasefire in Donbass that stood, even if Putin renounced the use of force in an unlikely example, the pressure would just turn to another dimension. It would still be there. A friend of mine in Kiev, a Norwegian former DAO named Hans-Peter Mittung, some of you probably know him, has a great phrase to describe what's going on. It's just to say the main battle space occurs not on the battlefield, but in the cognitive spaces of the target population, of the decision-making and policymakers in the West and elsewhere, in think tank land. How do we conceptualize all of this in a coherent way? That's the challenge, and in fact, in many ways, Putin has had a lot of success. You still see silliness percolate through many papers in DC, which Glenn and I and others have debated in the last several weeks. We need to think of this as multidimensional pressure. Let me give you some examples. In diplomacy, which is in many ways a hard, soft tool, we have seen Russia using its diplomatic offensives to increase pressure on NATO, on Poland, on the United States. And this is part of a coordinated campaign, as I said. Number two, political. We've seen talk about a coup in Kiev last week. We've seen really a virulent anti-Zelensky campaign by some of the national media. We've seen skunks like Medvedchuk around trying to put pressure on the Ukrainian government, democratically elected, to get it to collapse and submit to Russia's will. And I think it's I could say, I think with some confidence that the resistance to the COVID vaccine in Ukraine is also part of Russia's multidimensional strategy. Number three, energy. All of us here on this panel have talked about Nord Stream 2 and the way Russia seems to court parts of the German elite in particular. That is part of this combined multidimensional operation. Economic pressure, we know Russia provides all sorts of financing to foster corruption in Ukraine, to undermine the judicial in Ukraine. And I could give you many, many examples, but we all know this. Finally, second to the last, informational. You still see people talking about Russia not being in Ukraine. You see people talking about the little green men. You see people talking all sorts of nonsense. I would argue even that after 7 years after the foreign policy elites here woke up to the idea of disinformation as a foreign policy tool, it is Ukraine that remains the major success. We still talk about the problem. We still talk about the issue in terms that were framed in the Kremlin. The Russian speakers want this, disinformation, the little green men. Every day there's some nonsense in the Russian press about what's going on. And this is, again, a reflection of their success in manipulating the information space. Finally, military. I think we've all spent a lot of time on this in the past couple of weeks, as I said. The military is obviously the most powerful dimension in this combined dimensional assault. And we all keep a lot of attention to it. But I would suggest that we should not think of this as either a blitzkrieg or not. There are a lot of things in the intermediate level which Russia can do to exert military pressure on Ukraine. In fact, even a political solution that involves some kind of reconstruction of Donbass might have, in the view of some misguided individuals, a Russian, in quotes, peacekeeping condition. They will use this, they will manipulate this, and I think we ought to be more conscious to debate more than we have these intermediate levels of military involvement. I will end there. I think I'm about at the end of my time, but looking forward to your questions. I think this is just the beginning of the crisis, not the end, as I said. And I haven't, even if there were a military solution at the moment, I have no illusions that Putin will do anything else but continue to try to subvert the Ukrainian state in the other ways and dimensions that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Over to you,
Thank
sir.
Very much, Don. I, of course, have a different question to open with you when it comes time, but I would love to hear your reaction to the following. I believe that we're over-reliant on sanctions when we deal with Russia on these issues. And I think I heard you mention that we should be more out there in the diplomatic, informational, and military areas as well. And so we'll hopefully have time to get to that a little later. Dr. Joja, your opening remarks.
Thank you, General Breedlove, and thank you for our host, McConnell's, for putting this together. It's an honor to be here. And because we've already had throughout this day and in this panel, so many well-established voices on what is going on in Ukraine and in the Black Sea overall, what implications that has. I'm just going to make 2 points to sort of try to add my 2 cents on that. The first one I've said last time in this conference, but I don't think it can be overstated. The Black Sea overall, as we're looking at it in a general panel level, regional level, is right now and has been for a while one of the most insecure security environments in the world. It's more unstable than the Baltic Sea, looking at the track record of the last 20, 30 years. It's, I would argue, just as unstable as the South China Sea, but with more actors and more complexity that these actors bring to it. So with that in mind, the questions that we're trying to answer, and we've done a good job so far, but I think there's a lot more to be done to figure out a better strategy for the region coming from the West, is to think about how we can deal with this extremely challenging environment in terms of how to avoid escalation without getting into Putin's cycle. And on the other side, so controlling escalation on one side, and on the other side, how to actually compete. We're talking in this administration about strategic competition. I would argue that in the Black Sea, we have not figured out, and we do not have, because of the constricting environment, enough instruments to be actually able to prevent escalation in the region, as we've seen it at the beginning of this year, and now again with Putin's move on Ukraine or to the border. The other point that I want to kind of add a little bit to the debate and broaden it, because I think it makes us better understand Russian strategy for the region and beyond, is to look at the patterns that have emerged over the last few decades in the Black Sea, and how they, for several years now, have been replicating the same kinds of patterns and the same kind of strategy south into the Mediterranean, specifically Eastern Mediterranean, but generally the Middle East. The argument being basically that what happens in the Black Sea does not stay in the Black Sea, that we're looking at Russian strategy as what we now call an arc of steel, all the way from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, and that the militarization that we have been seeing with this full spectrum of hybrid warfare, but also with military capabilities on the ground in Crimea and beyond in the Black Sea from the Russian side, this is a pattern that is now being replicated beyond the Black Sea into the Eastern Med, and beyond that as well, with the Black Sea fleet of Russia as the focus, as being built to augment the capabilities that underpin the Mediterranean activity that they have. But we see, for instance, we've been looking at the militarization of the Black Sea, A2AD as initially something defensive. Now we've started to understand that it's becoming offensive. We see the same thing on a smaller scale in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East, particularly looking at Syria. We have now a Russian new, very ambitious maritime strategy that applies to both spaces and beyond, and that is really focused on sea denial of NATO and beyond NATO. We see a pattern in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East of Russia either aiding client states or intervening in states for them to become client states. And with that, we also see increasingly patterns of new opponent relations developing. If we're looking over the last few months at reports in this region of, for instance, Russia using with maritime means is helping Iran, according to reports, to ship weapons to Syria, and is creating in that way new enemy relations and new opposition by new actors in the relationship to Russia, like Israel. That's also something that we should keep in mind, just as well as combat experience that Russia has accumulated in the Donbass and is now doing the same for several years in the Eastern Med space and the general Med space. So these are just a few things to throw out there to kind of open the discussion in terms of what are the patterns that we've seen now established in the Black Sea region in terms of Russian aggression, building, developing, and escalating. We know that it's likely that they will become more developed and more aggressive in the years to come in this space, but it makes sense to look beyond this very limited geographic and maritime space to see how the Black Sea is now a power projection tool for Russian power across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia, for your remarks. Over to Glenn Howard. And Glenn, just one more compliment on the great fact-based dialogue that Jamestown carries on in your spaces. So, sir, your opening remarks.
Thank you. Well, it's all about the facts, and that's, I think, a lot of times, as everyone knows, Washington is full of opinion. So it's very difficult to kind of get where do the facts fit within all the opinion that's floating around about and different presumptions about different countries. And I say that is for people who criticize Ukraine and those who support Ukraine. But as Gerald, you there are two, as you know, there's two great philosophers of war. One of them is Clausewitz and the other is Jomini. And Jomini is very close to your heart, I know. And Jomini said something very profound. He said that war is theater. And I think that at this moment, what captures what is going on around Ukraine in this buildup is at various levels of theater. Don called it a multidimensional pressure. I call it a level of theater that is not just being used by the Russians, but also being used internally by Ukraine. It's also being used by the United States. And why is that important is because the facts here really kind of, we lose sight of, when we hear things like Russia has 100,000 men on the border, well, naturally our first inclinations are to think, well, oh my God, Russia's getting ready to come across the border at any moment, and they make the mistake of thinking, well, Ukraine is Georgia, a country of 3 million is juxtaposed to a country of 45 million. Well, Ukraine gets a vote in this, and anybody that knows anything about warfare knows that when you're on the defensive, the attacker must have a 3-to-1 advantage over you. And Ukraine has 95,000 men army. It has a reserve call up within 30 days of 250 to 300,000 men. Now that is not Georgia, and that is a country the size of France. And when we take these into consideration, we have to understand that, as we all watched what happened in Donbass, is that Ukrainians don't lay down and don't, throw away their guns and run away. This isn't the Afghan army. Okay, Ukraine has the military potential to fight back. And when we start looking at all these numbers and the Russians talking about doing things, we need to keep one thing in consideration, that war is theater in the sense that we know that Victoria Nuland has had talks with Kozak. We know that the talks and her meetings in Moscow discussed as being bantered around in Washington by those who are stating or advocating that the immense agreement with the special status or autonomy for Donbass is something we need to make Ukraine make a concession on. So if we add that to the mix, and the fact that Russians are quite adept at using reflexive control to try to get us to do things that they want us to do without actually firing a bullet, then maybe all of this, as Don calls the multidimensional aspect, is maybe what this is all about. It is theater. Because we know, and I know from a meeting that I had with the Ukrainian Minister of Defense Reznikov 2 weeks ago, we know that not all those numbers of tents on the Russian border actually have heat signatures. In other words, there is a weather component here, and that anybody that's huddled on the Ukrainian border in the middle of winter, and it's pretty, reasonably cold inside of Ukraine and on the border of Russia, they would need heat in those tents. And what the Ukrainians have revealed is that not all of those tents are filled with people. There is an element of Russian Maskirovka military deception that's being used, and we're falling into it. And I'm afraid the Pentagon is falling into it, because they're looking through the satellites at what they see on the ground, and they're saying, oh my God, we see all these capabilities. But let's ask, what are the intentions? And do they have the numbers to succeed in what they want? And that's where I think a lot of this debate needs to go. And I'll throw in here as the last part of my opening comments, what the Washington Post said in the report that was circulated today about Ukraine and the buildup. The quote unquote Post wrote, administration officials are trying to craft an approach that neither appeases Russia nor provokes significant escalation. Well, boy, howdy, doesn't that complicate your ability to respond? So keep in mind, we're sending in plane loads of ammunition that from US excess stocks. In fact, the largest amount of ammunition that we've sent, they had $100 million, and now that $60 million US ammunition was sent to Ukraine. Okay, well, I would ask everybody in the room, do a quick math count. How many M16s does the Ukrainian army have? A couple thousand, maybe? So is US policy here all about a little bit of theater on our part and trying to bolster Ukraine, which I don't disagree with, and I'm not saying they're not taking Ukraine or the Russian threat seriously, but there's an element of theater here And when I asked someone about why is the U.S. sending all this U.S.-made ammunition to Ukraine, which they can't use, they need Soviet AK-47 ammo, which is what the Russians were doing in blowing up all the ammo dumps in Europe. That is what they need. And sadly, this is where it's falling in, because someone on the Hill said, well, we wrote in the language to send them ammunition, we didn't specify what caliber. Did nobody thought to say, oh, well, maybe we should send AK-47 ammunition as opposed to M16. So there's a problem here, as this statement says, about the way we're approaching this conflict and the way we look at it and the way we start using the word deterrence. I listened to Laura Cooper give a talk the other day, gave a wonderful talk at CSIS, but I never heard in the span of 1 hour conversation, the word deterrence was not used. Not used. Instead, we get to all these Pentagon buzzwords like multi-domain warfare, all these terms and knowledge things that we use, but we really, do they apply to Ukraine? And I'm not so sure about that. So anyway, I will end on that observation, that note, and try to answer your question when you come to it back to me, Phil. Thank you.
Great panelists. Already we've got some chewy things and some left and right working here. So I'm really pleased with the opening remarks. To remind the audience, I'm going to ask each of the panelists now a question. And when that is done, we'll start taking your questions. So go to the Q&A icon below, type in your questions, and we'll try to get to them when the time comes. Ian, I kind of forewarned you. You gave a wonderful rendition of the paper, which I just recently read. And now what I'd like you to do, I heard you run through it, sort of grade our paper. Is our US approach tracking with what worked before? Is it appropriate that we stay close to that, which I believe you have articulated? And give me a read of where you think we are in this process.
Great. Well, Phil, I think, there are 3 or 4 dimensions I would look at and compare. If you look at the kind of the consultations that are going on between the United States and Ukraine, the United States and its key allies, they're actually pretty good. They're pretty intense, and they've contributed to allied unity, and to maybe even to a certain degree resolve. So I actually give the administration high marks on that. I'm a little bit more worried on the other dimensions. For example, on the economic dimension, we are still locked in a pattern of pinprick sanctions. If we're going to be serious about this, we have to have sanctions that are going to have real leverage and political impact, which means they have to be sectoral sanctions. They have to cut off all access to credit, or threaten to cut off all access to credit, cut back trade, if not entirely, significantly, and probably even involve a cutback in our digestion of Soviet gas and oil. There's got to be some economic sacrifice the West will have to undertake in order to really put on the full leverage that will be necessary to cause Putin to shift the direction of his ship. Similarly, on the military dimension, we're nowhere near what we were postured on our Eastern Front back in the 1980s. I mean, there were 20 divisions on the line, dozens more ready to go to flow in reinforcement. We took a highly symbolic move of moving those AWACS in there. Our posture in Central and Eastern Europe on our eastern frontier is very, very dilute, and we have to address that, which means I'm recommending that we ought to be moving some brigades up into Poland's eastern frontier, some units into the Baltics, maybe threaten a little bit Kaliningrad and Romania. Putin responds to that kind of muscle movement. That is kind of muscle movement is necessary to give credibility to economic sanctions. And we also ought to be increasing the alliance's presence in Ukraine, stepping up our exercises, particularly in eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, perhaps some ground exercises, some aircraft exercises, air defense exercises, all of which will help complicate Russian military planning. There ought to be an informational dimension. We ought to be stepping up our information war against Putin right now. He's already intervened in our backyard. No reason why under these circumstances we shouldn't be putting some political pressure on him. And this is all about, making very clear to Putin the costs of an intervention. And I think I'll just close with one kind of point. The question before us is not a matter of Western allied military and economic capability. It is a question of our political will and determination.
Okay, thank you. Don, Dr. Jensen, one of your recent pieces I read was quite good, and it talked about Russia and the US exploring deeper relations, were the words you used. Many of us want dialogue. I don't think anybody wants to fight. That dialogue needs to lead to less tension. And I believe that there are worries among the Ukrainian leaders and others that dialogue not lead to undue concessions by the Ukrainian side. So how do we have this dialogue that'll lead to less tension? And in your opinion, sort of, again, grade our paper where we are at now. Are we headed in that right direction?
A complicated question, Phil. Thank you. I try to be nonpartisan, but let me talk about the issues I raised, which is that I was arguing that both sides, and you go by their statements, want a relationship that what's the phrase, stable but predictable, or whatever it is that Tori has said, and that means agreeing on some things where there are so-called common interests and disagreeing and when there are not, and that's much, let me say, much more easier said than done. First of all, because you cannot, the wall between common interests and agreeing to disagree is not at all clear. The Russians see some of these issues as quite differently than we do in different terms. Second, even if there were agreement on what we should talk about, certainly strategic stability is one of those, for example. The Russians are hitri, as they say. There is no assurance that they are not going to practice linkage, which is to say, we will help you on a deal with Iran if you sell Ukraine down the river, or we will do this on energy if you give us a concession on something else. This is something we have to be very, very careful about. And third, I would say that it's very important for any administration to have a coherent position, team, view on some of these issues. That takes a while to work out. And if there's a contradiction or we're sending out mixed messages, whatever the problem might be, the Russians are very, very attuned to exploiting that. And I'm not going to talk about any particular administration, but there's what seems to be very simple, agree and then disagree on other things, is in practice much more complicated. I would add as a footnote, Phil, that when you have both sides talking without the Ukrainians present, as seems to happen far too often, when you practice great power, everybody knows there's great power competition, but let's call it international relations realism, without fully understanding that societies are built from the ground up, not from the top down. There's no indication at all that a country like Ukraine, which is strongly pro-NATO, strongly pro-EU, proud of its democratic achievements, which have been impressive in the past 7 or 8 years, the country is not going to come along without involving Ukraine and involving the society as well as just the top leadership. It could be Poroshenko, it could be Zelensky. In some ways, it doesn't matter. You've got to look at the bigger picture.
Great, sir. Thank you very much. Yulia, I follow your work closely, and I think you've had a very mature presence in both print and in the public concerning what the Black Sea is seeing and doing, and the tensions that reside there. You mentioned this in your opening remarks. So if there was another physical transgression of the borders of Ukraine by Russia, what would you expect from Black Sea nations, to include those not in NATO? And what do you think the Black Sea nations would expect from NATO?
That's a very good question. And I believe if Mr. Putin would have the answer to that, we would have a clear response. So we're still figuring it out. But I think there's a few things to be kept in mind. So just to, in one sentence, try to answer your question, it depends. It depends how extensive that intervention is, and it depends on the context, unfortunately. And I say that just with a pragmatic and realistic view on the fact that Black Sea nations in or outside of NATO, aspiring already full members, have been seeing this pattern of intervention, of Russian aggression far too many times in the last few decades, with no adequate military response from NATO or the United States at that moment, unfortunately, whether that was frozen conflicts in the 90s, so-called, or 2008 Georgia, or 2014 Ukraine. We have built within NATO and the West, we've built a strategy for the Black Sea that I cannot say often enough is inadequate, in that it is in response to 2014, and yet we do not have NATO troops on the ground, unlike we have in the Baltic Sea. We do not have a much needed maritime strategy for NATO in the region, or continuous significant military deterrence. And then the other thing, to answer your question, that we should keep in mind is also the hearts and minds of Black Sea people, because you can rarely find, despite the environment being so challenging and Russian aggression so multifaceted, you can barely find regions in the world where on both sides of NATO, people are still so much pro-West, pro-NATO, and pro-the United States, to be frank. But with every further military aggression and lack of response from the West, obviously the intensity of the love of hearts and minds in the region for the West is decreasing. So we need to keep that in mind too, and how dangerous that can be in the long term. We've seen partially responses to that at the level of public opinion around the Afghanistan withdrawal. And so I'm afraid that this could be worse and replicated if we're talking about, if we are to see a significant Russian intervention in the region. When it comes to NATO per se, I think there is a big differentiation that Black Sea countries on both sides of NATO make between NATO and the United States, because frankly, until very recently, not only, but mostly, we've seen only the United States building up deterrence. And only in the last few years, we've seen a little bit of help when we look at Ukraine from the UK. That's great, and from Turkey, with a complicated relationship that Turkey has with NATO. And so I think we need to think also about how we can engage more NATO in the region, how we can build regional strategy for NATO, for the Black Sea region, where not just the United States is there, but others have much more significant presence and help in deterrence. We know that we cannot offer right now, because of political issues among member states, full membership to neither Ukraine or Georgia, but it's important as a political message vis-a-vis Russia to keep that on the table. So we need to think in the context of a new NATO strategy of how to upgrade these partnerships that we right now have with Ukraine and Georgia into 2.0, with significant measures such as real trust funds, more training, more lessons learned from them to send a political message also in terms of military strategy. And then we need to also think about how the United States as an actor overall can do more. And here I can only congratulate and be of surprise that we've seen a significant response from the United States over the last few months and years. Right now, in this context, the best example, I think, when we're looking at NATO members in the region is Romania, where we have the development in the last few years from 1 base to 2 bases to 3 US bases. 2 of the last 2 of the 3 are significantly developed. There's now first reports in the media of 1,000 or 2,000, unclear yet, more troops to be deployed. That is a fantastic measure that makes a real difference in terms of moving. And with this, I'll close. I'll close my answer of the question. Moving from what we're talking about containment, what we're talking about in terms of deterrence. Are we talking about deterrence? Is it adequate or not? To think about how to invest in strategic partnerships between the United States and its allies, both sides of NATO in the Black Sea, to help contain Russian aggression in the region and beyond the region, vis-a-vis my point earlier on about the Mediterranean. How can we invest in strategic partnerships that are stable politically and militarily, so that we make a difference in moving overall Western strategy in the region from just deterrence or inadequate deterrence to containing in the long term.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll be back to you with some more things. Glenn, I think you've kind of tipped your hand in your opening remarks, but my question to you is, among all the options that have been discussed, what is the scary scenario to you? What do you worry most in this current sort of lay down and the options that Mr. Putin has at his hand?
Well, Phil, that's a great question. I'm a great fan of Liddell Hart and the theory of the indirect approach. And so my concern about the Russians is not looking for the obvious, but looking for the obscure and the indirect threat that may be coming that we're not anticipating. And I think that that's really important when we look at all the things that we see arrayed against Ukraine. I think the first and foremost problem that we have within NATO, and this was echoed and first came as a point by Phil Peterson, is that when we talk about the Black Sea at NATO, we talk about it like it's a region and not a military front. So when you look at the way the Russians, we use terms like A2AD and Crimea, and we use these terms, we need to keep in mind that when the Russians put up their maps and they put up plans, their plans are war plans, and their ideas are different axes of approach and strategy. And we all agree that Ukraine is the prize. And so to quote Ian's father, I can't resist it, Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. And so when we get that question by US policymakers, well, what does Ukraine matter? We need to answer with that, because it does matter. But when we look at Ukraine, Ukraine all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea is a part of a flank. It is a front. But when we look at how we defend Ukraine, we need to think of it from the strategy of a military front and how Russia would approach it. And there are so many different angles and approaches that Russia can use. For example, when we have seen a lot of things going on in Belarus, we followed with Ukrainian policymakers who I met with, say, well, we got to do something about Belarus. We need to start harboring the opposition, and we need to help support Belarus. And then now we're getting scenes of Lukashenko calling for the threat emanating from Ukraine. And we're starting to see signs that if you're sitting in Kiev and you're looking at a map, the last thing you want is an invasion front through the Pripyat marshes through Belarus. You don't want your war planning to be even more complicated by adding more fronts. And my concern and problem that I see now is the Ukrainian policy side is rightfully very concerned about a lot of things, but there's also very telling in what they're not talking about. And when Minister of Defense Reznikov first became defense minister, the first trip that he took was not to the Black Sea region, but he went down to the various other, he went to Berdyansk and he went down to Mariupol. He went to the most obvious areas where there'd be a Russian potential flanking attack on Ukraine. And this is what concerns me the most is today, in the last couple of days, the two landing ships, the Minsk and the Korolev, are headed to the Black Sea. Those are very large landing ships. And once they hit the Black Sea, then it's anybody's guess as to where they'll be going. Now, we made a map at Jamestown, it's a very good map of Black Sea military bases, and the Russians have been investing a lot of infrastructure development on the western side of Crimea. And if that area, if you look at it, and I think in your previous speaker, Andrei Zarodnyuk was talking about the militarization of the oil and gas rigs in the Black Sea. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to look at the map and see, my God, you know, if they block Odessa, they're taking out 1/3 of Ukraine's economy. In other words, they've got the chokehold on the Sea of Azov, and then they got the chokehold on the northwestern part of the Black Sea. And the only thing that Ukraine has to defend that are 3 island-class patrol boats with 2 more that just arrived. So they now have 5, but sadly, they're not armed. So they're trying to arm these as we speak, but that's not enough. And so yesterday it was announced that the Arleigh Burke is now entering the Black Sea on another rotational deployment. Our hands are constrained and restrained by the Montreux Convention. We have 21 days at a time naval strategy in the Black Sea. We're limited in what we can do. So when you ask me which one worries me the most, I'm worried that we're too focused, and rightfully we should be looking at what the Russian buildup is doing, but they've got a lot of manpower and equipment in Crimea. And let us not forget that the water reservoirs at Novokakhovka are very, very open to an attack. And if they take the water reservoirs and they solve their water problem in Crimea, and I am not one to say that Russia is, if Putin moves and does something, I don't think it's going to be now, but it could be later. And when I asked Ukrainian military people about the potential for an invasion now, first thing they bring up is the weather. And the Russian term Rasputitsa, which means mud. And so you can't do armored movements in Ukraine in November. The mud is too thick. They're not mobile, but they could be mobile and pose a threat in January, February when it's frozen. So that's why I start off my remarks with talking about the theater component of what we're seeing. And we need to take the weather into factor, but we also need to keep in mind that outside of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer headed to Odessa, that's it. Okay, that's our defense of the Black Sea. The Romanian Navy can't put to sea. It's got a handful of antiquated warships. It's got a naval program that's been postponed repeatedly. So the only one with a naval force in the Black Sea is that could counter Russia is a country we're currently estranged with, and that's Turkey. Now, I'll point out to one thing and I'll close it. One of the promising things that happened on October 26th was when the Ukrainians ordered the first use of their Bayraktar drone, which is now the Turks have forbidden the Ukrainians from calling it the Bayraktar. They want to call it by something else other than their Turkish drone. But the new chief of the general staff of Ukraine, General Zaluzhny, ordered on October 26th a drone strike using their new drones, and they took out several howitzer positions that were being fired on. Anybody who's been following Donbass knows that Ukrainian soldiers have caveats on how they can respond. So they can't respond with artillery; they have to respond with their mortars. And one of the problems has been many of the Ukrainian soldiers are complaining about is that they don't have the capabilities or the approval from Zelensky to be able to fight back when they're hit. And so part of the problem has been that, but then with Zaluzhny coming in, he did something very interesting on October 26th. He experimented with the use of the drones. And let me tell you something, they worked. They put the fright back into the Russians. The artillery shelling is somewhat diminished. And for the first time, they revealed their drones. So that is a real critical component. And let me finish one last point. When I saw the Mr. Defense Reznikov, I asked him about, because there's some rumors that the Turks told the Ukrainians not to use the drones. He confirmed that they did and never received any type of criticism from Turkey for doing that. What they were criticized for was by the media referring to them as the Turkish drones. So I said, let's give them a Ukrainian name and use them from then on. I'll stop there.
Okay, I think we lost the end. I was going to see if he had any last remarks. Let me add to the concern that you just talked to. We've got several questions and we're going to go to those in a minute. While I am not a ground warfare expert, I did serve with the Army, 2nd Brigade, 3rd ID. And when I look at the current map of the laydown of Ukrainian forces and the amount of their best forces that are at or near the line of contact in that along the edge of Donbass, I think of the Maginot Line, and you talked about indirect approach. And the force that is also further north in the central district and the northern southern district that could very easily run through Belarus and be on top of the Kyiv, on top of Kyiv, and have bypassed all of that force along the line of contact. That worries me as well. So we have a question from one of our friends and one of our great thinkers, Miss Deborah Kagan, and I'll just read it and then I'll take a crack at it and then also open it up to the rest of the panel. Deborah writes, how can NATO or NATO forces implement routine FON ops, for those who don't know that acronym, Freedom of Navigation Ops, in the Black Sea without full consensus, and how to get Turkey to expand the definition of 21 days under Montreux. So I want to take a crack at the first part of that, and then I want to allow the others to help me to address Montreux. I have some thoughts there as well, but I want to involve the panel and not the moderator. So Deborah, it's a great question. And the first thing that I would offer is, much like what happened in the spring of 14, we don't always have to have consensus and act as a full NATO requirement. When we first had the attack into Crimea, there was a lot of concern in what I call the exposed nations about, you know, Mr. NATO, Mr. Sakir, what are you going to do about this? And we went into deliberations with the NAC and others, and we were working through that process when the second attack, of course, came where the Russians went across the border into the Donbass. And again, the exposed nations came to me as the SACEUR, and we went to the NAC to propose some actions. And the NAC was not immediately accepting of those actions and began a deliberative process. And this is how NATO works. Then the US European Command Commander, who shaves every morning with the SACEUR, worked with the US European staff and proposed some options up through the US side. And the two bosses of any Quebec commander are the SecDef and the president. Then the SecDef and the president approved the actions that I proposed. And so the next day, as the US European Command Commander, I directed forces from my command, under my command in Europe, to begin to fly CAP over the Baltic nations. And the Lakenheath Wing, the Liberty Wing responded, and we literally from 18 hours from the go command, we had CAP over the Baltic nations. Why do I bring this up? What almost immediately happened when the US did a US unilateral response to an issue that was happening, and they were doing that because of their bilateral relationships with those three nations. Immediately when the US began to fly those caps, other nations came aboard and started offering all manner of things to help with that. So a small coalition of the willing began to take action. And shortly thereafter, the NAC decided we need to be involved, and boom, now it became a NATO operation, and it was about enhanced NATO air policing. And so it morphed into a NATO operation. And I believe that that's a model in a lot of cases. You know, I think that many people don't understand that Article 3 and Article 5, not only about is it if one is attacked or all attacked, but it describes a relationship of 28 bilateral relationships. And America came to the response of the three Baltic nations because of the bilateral relationships with those nations. And then others followed. So, Deborah, I share your concern. I read it in your question. I believe that in most cases, to get to what you're talking about on these spawn ops, it will have to start with some nations, and that has already taken place. The U.S., as you know, does spawn ops all the time there. The Black Sea, or the 4 dedicated Aegis capability stationed at Rhoda are routinely in the Black Sea, as Glenn described, the one going towards the Black Sea now. And when they go in the Black Sea, they have a pattern that challenges spawn at every time. And now we've seen the Brits join us. And to Glenn's remarks, I think it's time for others to begin to be a part of that effort. So I will throw that out there. Glenn, you want a 2-finger, and then
Yeah, as a 2-finger, Phil, you're late to the ball game here. On June 29th, HMS Defender did a right of innocent passage right off of Gorbachev's Dock in Crimea. Okay,
so that's what I referred to. The Brits have already joined
well,
us.
okay, and the USS Porter was asked to participate in this, and we said no. Okay, so let me tell you something here. The Brits were already demonstrating this great capabilities, and then sadly, we did not join them. Okay, and so this 21 days at a time, regarding Deborah's question, is that Ben Hodge has already answered that question a long time ago, that the U.S. is not even, it's not about Turkey. First of all, the U.S. is not even putting enough ships into the Black Sea when it has them to go into they're way short of the quota on 21 days at a time. They're not sending the warships. So before we start pointing our finger at the Turks, why don't we up our game a little bit? But then why don't we join in back up a right of innocent passage off of Crimea? Because I'll tell you something, it took the Russian Navy, the Russians, 2 days before they recognized that the HMS Evertsen, the Dutch frigate, was on its tail. In other words, that operation revealed flaws in Russian radar coverage. They didn't even detect it. They didn't even complain about it until 2 or 3 days later. So my point is that until you start showing deterrence and right of innocent passage and showing a little bit of vigor in what you want to do in terms of deterrence, you've got to up your own game. But again, we're riding defense here, and we're very much fearful of this escalation. And there's no measures of effectiveness for Ukraine. Okay, they started a building program for corvettes. Okay, and this program is going to take 20 to 30 years before they even have the warships, and they won't spend the money to buy the Mark 6 attack boats, and they won't even spend the money to arm them. Now, luckily, the U.S. is sending the Mark 6s, 5 of them, but it's a question where they're going to have the armament on them. My last point is we, as an alliance, as NATO, and the United States are doing nothing to complicate Russian defense planning in the Black Sea, okay? It's everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else, and we're not holding the Ukrainians' toes to the fire, and they refuse to mutter the word Navy in terms of their rhetoric. When I met with the Ukrainian defense minister, there was not a single Navy guy in the room, not a single. It was nothing but officers, about 11 men in the room, and not a single Navy guy. Now that's just, to me, that's just outrageous. So
provocative as always. I will assert, though, that we continue our freedom of navigation operations there. You are right. There was a decision made not to go with the Brits. I don't have the skinny on that, so I cannot remark to it. But it would have been a better situation in my mind if we'd have been there with them. But we do the preponderance of fawn ops in and around Crimea with our ships that are stationed at Rhoda. So I think we've got to keep that going. I agree with you that we could do more, and that would be very helpful. So Don, Yulia, anything you want to add?
Sure, I can add a little bit to what has already been said. Basically, just on the Montreux Convention, having not much more to add other than what Gled said, that we're not taking maximum advantage of the limited access that non-Black Sea navies have to the Montreux, but we need to take into account also that there's a lot more, I would say, maybe a lot more flexibility when it comes to thinking about the Black Sea axis and Turkey, if we are thinking of the right approaches in how to socialize Turkey to the fact that they are growing accustomed to, unlike 4 years ago, when we're looking, because I know that's always a question, what is Turkey doing in the Black Sea? What is the role? Indeed, Turkey over the last few decades has not prioritized the Black Sea, and they're the only force that can actually countervene to Russia. But they have, over the last few years, also grown accustomed to the reality that the Black Sea is becoming a Russian lake, and that it's not in their interest too, neither. And so we can think politically about how to draw Turkey in closer through third allies such as Romania and Poland. On the Montreux Convention and the limits thereof, if we are, and Glenn was right to point out that we're not ready at this point to take maximum advantage, or have not been so far, but if we were hypothetically to talk about how to force the hand in the region to create more continuously rotational, not permanent presence in the Black Sea, there's always the very simple solution of reflagging temporarily, and that goes perfectly around the Montreux Convention. I know that politically this has not been discussed yet, but it is something that can be done for a month, for a year. There's precedents around the world, and there's always new precedents that can be created. The one thing a bit next to the Montreux Convention that I just want to throw out there, because I think it's important that Glenn, I think, mentioned that about the drones and the success so far based on lessons learned, again, from the Black Sea region, Nagorno-Karabakh too, is that we also have to think in terms of escalation and what the West is prepared to do and what it is prepared to see in terms of escalation and red lines, etc. If we are thinking hypothetically about another intervention, another military territorial aggression of Russia against Ukraine, they have tested Ukrainians, the drones, but so have the Russians, including in the Zapad of this year exercise. So if we're thinking medium to long term, we have not so far seen a drone-to-drone conflict. We know that we don't even want to think about it because it can look very messy and devastating. But it is something that we should take into account in terms of strategic and military thinking in the region, because it becomes more and more of a real possibility in the region and beyond that. So just to throw that out there.
Just as a two finger, and then I'll see if Dawn has remarks. We saw sort of a first generation Russian use of drones in the original battles of the Donbass, obviously, where we saw Russian drones informing Smerch rockets, and in the battle for Debaltseve, we saw one of Ukraine's better infantry battalions essentially eliminated on the battlefield in that. So you're right, that could be a pretty devastating business. But clearly the idea that Ukraine is learning and now brings to the battlefield that capability will have to change the way that the Russians think about some things. Don, before we go on to the next question.
Nothing to add. I agree with Glenn and Yulia. I'm a missile guy, not Navy, so I'm learning from them.
Well, to that respect, several of you know that when I talk about naval capabilities for Ukraine, in my pea brain, one of my first suggestions is coastal defense cruise missiles. Yeah. It's not about ships or anything else, but if we had a very capable set of coastal defense cruise missiles, you could end the access to Sevastopol and really change the Russian patterns in the Black Sea. So I think that also should be considered. We're gonna fast run out of time here. We have a great question. I'm just gonna read it and then we'll shape around it. And one of us has already brought it up. Glenn, I'm embarrassed. It was either you or Ian that used the word pinprick sanctions. I don't know, it's important who said it, but it was said on
That was
this.
Ian.
Yeah, Ian brought that up. So here is the question. As part of the discussion about sanctions, a number of people on this, and including those on this panel, have talked about genuinely strong sanctions that could or would cripple Russia. In this context, there are those who argue we should design such sanctions and then tell Russia what they are and what we will do, but do it quietly so the Kremlin can back off quietly. It would also seem to me that we should prepare such sanctions and then present them to the world, publicly telling Putin what would happen. Does the panel have any views on these thoughts? Anybody want to take that one on first? Okay, okay, Don, go ahead. I've got.
I want to answer your question by not answering you for the question, which is to say, I'm not sure either is much preferable to the other. This is sort of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, quiet withdrawal of missiles in Turkey. I wouldn't call the sanctions pinprick. I would say they've had some effect, but I think we overestimate perhaps the capacity to deter Russian bad behavior. We do it partly because it feels good to slap them back. I have to admit that, but I don't think either of these alternatives will do much to change their behavior or deter it. But it does have effect on how our allies perceive what we're doing, and it's very important to keep most of the allies at least on board what we're doing, and that's going to make keeping them secret relatively difficult.
I'll have a little crack at this too, in that I want to again switch a bit the perspective. So American sanctions are one thing, European sanctions are another. We've seen great coordination between the two over the last few years since they've been put in place, 2014. But if we're looking at resources, and here I'm fully on board with Ian, I'm sorry he had to leave, that we need, if we are to talk about further sanctions, and if we are to think about sanctions that are effective in countering or deterring something, then we need to figure out sanctions with teeth. But we also know from 2014 that when the European powers were put in front of the possibility of sanctions, them not being first to impose them, but rather following suit with the United States, there were three major sectoral sanction types that we thought about in terms of really hurting the economy of Russia. And that is energy, and that is military capabilities, and that is finance assets. And in all these three domains, the linkages, as we know, between European powers, particularly Western European powers, and Russia are very strong. So when the questions were on the table, are the Europeans willing to, and me as a European, I'm very critical, I shouldn't be probably, but I can't help myself. When the questions were asked in terms of, should we impose energy sanctions? Should we impose finance sanctions or military? The three major European powers all said no to each one of them, where the ties were closer. You can figure out which one if you didn't already know. So looking at today, if we are to think about sanctions, and I'm fully on board with Ian that they need to be sectoral to really have immediate and medium and long-term consequences, we need to think about it from the perspective of transatlantic relations, how to convince Europeans, apropos, I think what he was saying earlier, that we need to think about the cost that this will bear on our economies transatlantically in general in this context, and how to convince Europeans that they should be willing to pay a higher price to be able to contain Russia, the most easiest example here at hand would obviously be Nord Stream 2 and the gas prices Germans are willing to pay in the context of energy being politicized and instrumentalized by Russia for many, many years now. So that's just to add to the discussion without really having a solution to that, but to be aware that if we are to think about sectoral sanctions that I would definitely support, we need to think about how to get the political consensus on both sides of the Atlantic to impose them.
So Glenn, I have a few remarks. Do you want to go first or do you want to?
No, I'm fine. I've yapped enough.
So I want to speak out of both sides of my mouth. First of all, when I teach a simple model of a nation's power. There are far better and more elaborate ones, but I use DIME: diplomatic power, informational power, military power, and economic power. And in my read of our dealings with Russia over the past years, we've really only used economic power. I believe that we face an all of government attack in all those realms when Russia comes at us. And we answer pretty much unilaterally in a silo of economic sanctions. So I would say, and I would acknowledge too, that we're beginning to see some of the work that Blinken and others are doing in the diplomatic realm. We're starting to see some substance there. But we need to have a more balanced, broad attack responding, in my opinion, in diplomatically. We need to be in the information game with truth, not disinformation. And we need to be more involved in the military game in making Ukraine a prickly pear and hard to swallow, as opposed to only relying on economic sanctions. That having been said, if we're going to do economic sanctions, I think I agree with everything that's been said by our esteemed panelists. They have to hurt. I would just say, Dr. Jensen, I would never disagree with the real professor, but I'm not sure that what we've done really has had effect, because my measurement of effect is, has it changed Mr. Putin's behavior? And I don't think it has. I think what you're saying is there are some effects out there, but I really don't believe we've changed Mr. Putin's behavior. And if we're going to do that with economic sanctions, as Yulia said, they got to have some big teeth in there, and they have to make an impact to the decision makers. Okay, we have another question.
Phil, if I could just respond. I do agree, actually. I said they have not had much of a deterrent effect, but they have had an effect.
Got it. Good, good. We're in violent agreement. A new question. It says, obviously, Ukraine does not have an ability to match Russian air power, and building Ukraine's air force and air power. But what should we be doing to start building Ukraine's air capability? I know that we in the Friends of Ukraine Network have made some suggestions in our writings and in our proposals to people in Washington, D.C. I'd like to throw this out first to the panelists, and then I might speak a little bit on it to close this up. Glenn, you want to start this one?
No, I tell you what, no, you go ahead, Phil.
All right, well, to set the stage, and then you all can remark. Often when we talk about air power, people get fixated on some neat toy, like we need to give them F-16s, which would be great. I flew the F-16 forever, and it's an amazing airplane in its current renditions. Or we focus on Stingers, or we focus on something else. And establishing air power, or at least local air superiority over your battlefield, is an absolute must. And that starts with a system. We have to be able to sense the enemy. We need to be able to discriminate and target the enemy. We need to be able to command and control all the tools at our disposal to deny the enemy our airspace, protect our soldiers on the ground. And then we need those tools, and they are layered and varied. one doesn't do it all. It starts with close in, low altitude defenses like Stingers. It moves to medium altitude capabilities, even like some of the old still used Hawks or Patriots. And then it goes to high altitude capabilities that are able to defend against ballistic missiles, etc. And that layered approach, coupled with the ability to sense and target and then command and control our response, that's what it takes to defend airspace. And so what we need to, in my opinion, now I'm offering my opinion, what we don't need to do is try to focus on any one silver bullet. We need to bring to this problem the full gamut of capabilities. Here's my question, and then I'm going to answer my own question.
I did think of something, Phil, if I could comment.
Sure, jump in real quick.
Okay. All the systems that people recommend for Ukraine are too costly for them. They don't have the budget. Patriots would take up over all of their defense budget. Yeah. So there's a problem there. And so they have got to go low tech. That's why they're looking at Turkish air defense weaponry, the HIMARS, which were very effective in Syria. And they were also using Turkish radio jammers as well with the drone. And there's a lot of things that the Turks can provide. But the problem with the way we come up with answers to help Ukraine are always the big bang fancy approaches. And when we're talking about air power, one thing comes to mind, and that's what the Estonians did. The Estonians said, okay, we're too small of a country. We can't build a modern air force. So what we'll do is build an air force that is built around the capabilities to help and assist NATO forces when they come in to reinforce us. And one of the things they developed were the JTACs, the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers. And if Ukraine would invest the money in training JTAC teams that could come in and direct U.S. airstrikes on the Russians when they come in and they do something stupid, see, that's the type of thing where you don't get Americans in harm's way and Americans die trying to defend Ukraine. You let Ukrainians do it. They want to do this, but they're not using the right thinking power in terms of thinking through about military effectiveness. They want to keep going with the big bang fancy projects, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, you sort of stole the remainder of my thunder. This system that I described is out of reach of Ukraine at this point. And the joke I tell is, do you know how long it takes to train a pilot with 10 years of experience? It takes 10 years to train a pilot with 10 years of experience. This doesn't happen overnight. And so building the capabilities to fly these aircraft, building the capabilities to employ the Patriot, all of these things are longer term that we need to talk about. But your point is on spot, and that is that Ukraine can do things that gives itself some capability and facilitates those who might come to Ukraine's aid. Being able to accept and operate to NATO standards and provide NATO areas to work from, this is what I'm talking about. We're going to have to cut short here because we need to finish in the next 2 minutes. So lightning remarks. Yulia, anything?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't have any conclusory remarks. I kind of started with them, but just a few very brief issues on how to think about Ukraine and other countries in the region in helping them build their national defenses, because that's a question that we've been asking all together. And I agree that in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, they can only afford the lower range, whether that's Army or Air Force or Navy. We also have to, apropos of a point made earlier, we have to take into account that their maritime forces have been completely destroyed, in both cases, Georgia and Ukraine, by the Russians. So they basically have to start from scratch. So I am for cutting them some slack, even though I criticize them a lot for not doing enough, and corruption and all of that, and that goes through the region. I think they need more support in terms of coordinated. And we also know that for the medium range, which I find really important as their next step in not just Ukraine and Georgia, but also countries like Romania and Bulgaria, who are scrambling to get the F-16s up and running, as you, General, suggested. There's that medium range where we can also think about how to help. And it shouldn't always be the United States that already does so much, but we can think about building trust funds within NATO, where NATO member states are saying, we're not willing to deliver lethal weapons, but we are willing to create trust funds based on their prioritization of needs to be able to think about building up allied support for patriots and for choppers like right now the United States is deploying to Romania to help Romanians beyond Ukraine. So just a few points to throw out there in terms of they should be able to do their own thing in terms of low range and invest. But for the medium range, the next step, we also have to think about how to help them on an allied level. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. Don, lightning remarks.
Well, finally, thank you for having me again. I think we have to realize in all of our discussion that the fate of Ukraine is for the Kremlin probably an existential issue for the regime, for Putin's rule. And we have to be prepared for this worthwhile cause we've talked about today, that this is going to last a long time and it's going to have stages, even if there were negotiations tomorrow. So we have to be prepared. And as everybody said on the panel, get ourselves, I think, better ready than we have been.
Glenn, lightning closing remarks.
I think the U.S. approach has to have some type of measures of effectiveness in terms of what we expect for Ukraine to do. And Ukraine holds its own fate. And Zelensky, in May of this year, passed a law on mobilization of its reserves. And what is ironic is that it took him until May of this year to pass that law. There is nothing more effective and having an impact on the media than for a country like Ukraine to announce we are mobilizing our 300,000 man territorial reserve force and they will be ready and activated in 1 week. And then watch the chaos that happens inside of Ukraine when that happens. But the message to the West is we will defend ourselves. We don't need NATO. We got a big army and we can we're big boys and we can take care of ourselves. And I think that type of reassurance sends a very strong message to the West, other than always saying, well, NATO needs to send warships in Ukraine. NATO needs to send Stingers. NATO needs to send javelins. You know, it's all about the big ticket items. It's not about the small things. Ukraine is not Georgia. I mean, it's a big country, but it's not behaving like a big country. So that's my problem.
Okay, so let me just close this out. We've run a little over time. I want to thank Bob and Nadia and the whole Friends of Ukraine Network for having us and giving us the platform to talk. I think this was a magnificent panel because we had some left to right kind of answers, and I so appreciate all of the people that were on here. I continue to follow your work out there in the real world, and it was a real pleasure to lead the panel. Bob, over to you for the closing.
Well, I want to thank all of you, and Ian, I'll thank him online for your participation and so forth. And I pitch one more time. It's time for us to start putting together the recommendations that we're going to submit to our government for 2022. And if we can, some immediate recommendations. There have been some requests from Capitol Hill for FOUN to give some, timely right now, what can we be doing? So I think there's work for us. I know that Phil's going to be gone for the month of December, but I hope he will be thinking. And I'll be tapping everybody with ideas because we're going to want to be presenting recommendations, and as we have in the past, advocating them to Congress and to the administration. With that, You've gone a little over time, which is fine, because our next formal program is at 9 o'clock, at 4 o'clock with Congresswoman Capter. In the meantime, Nadia and I and a couple will be just discussing some upcoming things with the foundation and with FOUN. So thank you very, very much.
Bye all.
Once again, I think I, for one, am very grateful that all of the people that participated in our sessions today, but also some other friends of the Friends of Ukraine Network initiative are really so very active and help, and that together, I think we are making, I think, a significant impact.
Well, I mean, Nadia, as I just said, and as you know, the Friends of Ukraine Network have been putting forward annual recommendations for some time. Those take effort. We have, as you've seen on our panels today, there are strong voices that are within various think tanks, university settings, other places, and the Friends of Ukraine Network bring them together collectively to come up with recommendations, which we have found maximizes the input of the recommendations because of who is making those recommendations. And as you know, and I'm saying for our audience, that once those recommendations are made and published, we distribute them, and we do more than distribute them. We get them to every member of Congress. We get them to places throughout the administration, and then we set up meetings and go and discuss them. And over time, it has become, I mean, well, I'll give one example. You know, during COVID, there were no in-person meetings. And so we had started off with meetings with committee chairmen and so forth, and all of a sudden there were no more in-person meetings. Well, over the course of the next several months, we had well over 100 conversations with staffers and members about those recommendations. The people on the Hill wanted to know not only what we were recommending, but why we were recommending and then discussing it. This year, when the recommendations were published, there were a couple of committees on the Hill. I said, do you want to have one-on-one personal, I mean, not one-on-one, but person-to-person meetings, and they were set up. And when our delegation went up there, General Breedlove, Ambassador Herbst, Phil Carver, Deborah, we find out that those were the first meetings that they had in 14 months, including among themselves. And I'm talking about a couple of committees where we meet with the bipartisan staff, not just the Republicans or the Democrats, but they come together to hear what we have to say. And we left one of those meetings with them asking for recommendations in a specific area, which we're trying to work on now to get back to them. It's a specific thing we had not covered. So, and since our recommendations have been up there, I've been getting, you know, contacts. What did FOUN think about this and that? So I believe that the effort to create, and if you want to call it administer, the FOUN has had its value, and it's adding a megaphone to some of the voices that have their own opportunities and so forth separately. But when you put them together, it's a louder voice.
Well, Robert, I also think a takeaway, certainly for me, I think us is, and I think this sort of came across all panels discussions, that the challenge to Putin and his aggression has to have, it's multi-dimensional. And I think to use General Breedlove's acronym, the DIME, you know, you need to use the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. I think our session with the Crimean platform certainly for me was also very important, because it reminds us, particularly looking at Crimea, that there are part of the hybrid war also is the cultural aspect. There's an environmental dimension. And so we need to broaden the information about, those parts of the overall hybrid war that is being conducted against Ukraine. So I think we will be talking to people engaged with the Crimean platform, but I think that is something that I think we need to continue focusing on and expanding and building on the success that Ukraine had in pulling together, 50 some countries, was it? So I think
I fully agree. And I mean, we've been working on Ukraine 35, 40 years here long before independence, and then far more focused since then. And when Putin invaded and occupied Crimea, I'm sorry to say, while everybody's upset about it, nobody wants to accept it. People, well, that's a bridge too far to think we're going to get him out of there. Well, that's not a bridge too far. And the Crimean platform has been set up. And I think we, the foundation, Friends of Ukraine Network, we want to work with it, expose it more, because that is the end objective. It's not just Donbass. It's Crimea, to get it back. And as I said earlier, I mean, the humanitarian crisis there, you add the word, I mean, I consider it part of the same thing, cultural, environmental. It's a devastating occupation to the land of Crimea, to the people of Crimea. And, Putin can have all his own views, and he can say that it was there and it's theirs and so on and so forth. Now, compared to the other oblasts of Ukraine, Crimea's majority voting for the referendum for independence was small. It was 53%. In this country, when we have an election and somebody has a 53% plurality, it's considered a major victory. So we shouldn't be saying that the Crimeans, the people in Crimea, were not interested in being part of Ukraine. They were.
and still are.
And still are. And if you look, you just don't want to look at the map and see that, other oblasts were 90 and 85% and so forth. But Crimea, a significant majority voted to be part of independent Ukraine, and their will has been dashed, and we cannot forget about that.
Earlier at the beginning, when we were trying to filibuster again for the time before the first panel to start, I talked about the fact that we are going to have this series of Ukraine and Washington events going through April. When we first started Ukraine and Washington for the 28th anniversary, 2011, it was like a 3-day extravaganza where we had a business conference, a political and policy discussion, and also ended up with a gala and had, made awards, Stars of Ukraine awards. That was great because it was an in-person event, and we do hope to, once it's practical to have in-person events, get back to that model. But we've pivoted. But one of the things, the ambassador reminded us that celebrating the referendum, that's why we chose December 1st when we did these big events, because celebrating the people of Ukraine and their achievements. And of course, the referendum vote was one of their achievements. What we're doing, somebody's putting up. Okay,
I thought you brought up the series. I thought I'd put it up there.
Okay. So that's going to be on the 13th. Also, maybe I'd like to remind everybody that we also have had a call for nominations for Stars of Ukraine. It's not a competition. It's not a contest, but we wanted to recognize 30 people from whatever sector who during this 30-year period of independence have achieved some level of success, notably most of the time international success, and who are contributing to the positive image of Ukraine. And we will be doing that later this month. But so again, ask people to maybe think of people that you think fit that category. Oh, they need to be citizens of Ukraine. So I think we still have a few days where we're accepting nominations, but we've already had some very exciting nominations that have come through, and we're looking forward to that event as well. So, okay, I think, let's see, it's 3:46. We are honored to have Congresswoman Capter come join us and give some keynote remarks. But why don't we take a break, a 10-minute break, and we'll see everybody gathering at 3:55.
Sounds good.
Okay, so please come back at 3:55. Thank you.